Welcome back to Geopolitics and Empire. Support the transmission by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack or over at Supercast or Apple subscriptions. Joining us for the first time is someone I greatly esteem. Can we call him a fellow Croatian American? Gary Kah. He's got a long bio. He's worked in government. He's traveled the world. He's the author of a number of books, including one which we'll be discussing, The New World Religion, The Spiritual Roots of Global Government, my favorite topic. He's a frequent speaker. He also publishes a bi-monthly newsletter called Hope for the World. Welcome, Gary.
Good to be with you, Horboye.
Well, thanks for taking the time. You know, this book has been sitting on my shelf for, I don't know, 5, 10 or 10 years. And I'm like, I got to get Gary on the podcast and read the book finally. You know, when I set a date, that forces me to read the book. I did it in 2 or 3 sittings. And I love it. Anything you want to add about your background? You've been doing this for over a quarter century.
Yeah, I was thinking about it the other day. My goodness. I began researching this back in 1982, 1983. So how many years is that? 43 years, 44 years ago. And I left my post with the government to write a book to try to document how the spiritual, political, and economic aspects of this globalist movement kind of interface. And that book came out back in 1992 called En Route to Global Occupation. And so that kind of launched what we've been doing ever since. So I've been doing talk shows and speaking engagements and writing updates and things since that time. So well over 30 years, and a lot has happened in the world since then. And in my book, The New World Religion, which focuses more on the religious underpinnings of all of this, came out in 1999. And I'm glad that I wrote these books when I did, because now writing it today, the same thing, it'd be writing it after the fact. But because they came out when they did, it was forewarning people. And now people are going back and reading these books and are saying, yes, this has merit because you warned us of all these things that are now exactly happening, laid out. And it's not because I can see into the future like a psychic. It's simply a lot of these people in their organizations have come out and told us kind of what they want to do over a period of time. And I was involved actually for a period of time in 2 organizations that were themselves involved in the globalist movement. So I feel like God gave me kind of an inside look, just enough to help put the pieces together. And one of those organizations, and we can go into this more in detail later, but one organization was inside of our government, and the other organization was outside of our government. So I can expand on that in a little bit. But to go back, you mentioned in the intro that we both have some Croatian roots. My father grew up in Croatia. He was born there, not too far from Zagreb. And when he was 12 years old, the partisans, who became known as the communists, began moving into their area. And he said that his family had about 1 to 2 days notice to either stay and run the risk of not being able to get out afterwards or to run for their lives. And so they formed a wagon train with some other relatives and friends and left everything behind, their farm, everything they had except a few pots and pans and suitcases of clothes, and that's about it. And they traveled wherever they could where the fighting was not taking place at that time. And they had some close calls. He went through one village right after the fighting occurred. And imagine this as a 12-year-old boy. They had to clear bodies out of the streets just so they could get through. Sometimes 2 or 3 bodies on top of each other. I mean, he saw a lot at a young age. But they made it through and went all over the place, went through part of Hungary, and then finally into the mountains of Austria, thinking they could ride out World War II in the mountains, that they'd be safe there. But within a month or so, he was brought he had to go to school somewhere, it was mandatory. And so he got sent away to a boarding school about 30 miles from his village where they lived. And within a short space of time, he came to discover that they were preparing these young people, ages roughly 12 to 16, to send them to the Eastern Front as cannon fodder for Hitler. The Hitler Youth, basically, that they were trying to bring him into. And the first tip-off was he was hardly learning any math or anything else, but they were doing a lot of marching and drills. And then one day he was walking by the headmaster's office, and the door was open a little bit. So he eavesdropped. He listened, and he could hear him talking to one of the other men in there. And that's when he realized what was really going on. And so that night, he and a friend jumped out of a 2-story window and ran for their lives. And miraculously, they got away. But he was, to survive at that age in the war, you had to be somewhat street smart, which he had become. So he realized if he would go home, they'd probably be waiting for him. And so he found a place about a third of a mile away, he said, kind of on a hilltop that was covered where they couldn't see him. And from there, he could see his house. And sure enough, by the time he got there, a day or so after he left from the school, he could see his mother talking to 2 men, and she threw her hands up in the air as if to say, I don't know where he is. He hadn't been home yet. And so he camped out in a neighbor's barn for like a month, just living in the hay, and with some people secretly bringing him food. And then not long after that, the war ended. So he had some close calls, but that was my father's story. And after the war, about 5 years after the war ended, in his late teenage years, he and his cousins, because they could speak a version of German, a German dialect that they learned in Croatia, because of that, they found that they could get into Germany and get work there, his goal being to save up money so that they could come to the States, because he had an uncle in Dayton, Ohio, that was willing to sponsor them in. And so in the 50s, my parents got married. My father met my mother in southern Germany, and they got married, then came to the States. And I was born in Dayton, Ohio, and grew up there. But my mother also, her father, my grandfather, was very outspoken against Hitler in the small village of 300 where they lived, to the point where some of the people in town said, Heinrich, if you don't shut up, you're going to get us all killed. And especially if he had a little bit of wine to drink, he would tell people what he really thought about Hitler. And so sure enough, one day, a couple of Hitler's henchmen showed up in that little farm village looking for my grandpa. But the mayor of the village was a friend of the family's, and his daughter and my mother were best friends. And so instead of telling them where my grandfather was, because they were looking for him, he sent them in the wrong direction to another village and said, last time I saw, he was over there. So as soon as they were out of sight, he tracked down my grandfather and said, you have to get out of here because they're looking for you. And so he went into the forest, deep into the forest, which back in those days, they had wild pigs and wolves. And, it wasn't it was kind of dangerous. And he hid out there for some time till the coast was clear. So on both my mother's side, my father's side, they were really fortunate to survive, but they did. They made it through the war. And I was able to grow up having a pretty normal life in Dayton, Ohio, which I'm very thankful for, and became a Christian at the age of 11. And that's when I really became more interested in international affairs. It was just like a switch went off in my mind. I wanted to understand why things were going the way they were in the world. And I guess I wasn't a typical 11-year-old, because I remember watching the evening news with my father at that age and just, asking some kind of deep questions and trying to understand why things went the way they did, even in World War II. So that's enough about my background. But I'm glad that Providence brought us together today to do this program together. It's a real pleasure to be on with you.
Yeah, and a lot of those isms, Nazism, communism, are the religion of the world government. They're a cult both of those. And now we're faced with what I call the bastard child of Nazism and communism, globalism, right? Which is the world government, so to speak. And my grandpa as well. I've got it up, that little red card up above. That's his. So he was obliged to be a partisan. And he ended up in a Nazi concentration camp in Bosnia for six months, and he survived. And in his card, I can see he stopped paying his dues in the 60s, obviously, because they told me that they'd come to your village and they'd oblige you either to become a Nazi or a partisan, and sometimes you didn't have a choice. And then obviously, my father, he actually got into trouble with Yugoslav authorities for, most Croatians in Yugoslavia wanted just an independent national Croatia, so not fans of communism nor Nazism. And so, maybe to start with the New Age, and I've made it a point. I don't care if people dislike it on the podcast, to have a more Christian perspective and to begin speaking out against this New Age Gnostic theosophy, because in the podcast space, in the alternative media space, in the independent media space, which purports to be anti-globalist, is in fact espousing globalist religion and ideology. And I'm like, well, guys, what's going on here? And so some of my peers are openly Gnostic, theosophic. Some of them are not openly and quietly theosophic, which is annoying. And so maybe just to start there and get your thoughts on giving us a sketch, this big picture sketch of this universal, I call it's a oneness. I cite Dr. Peter Jones of Truth Exchange, who's my go-to on that, and Carl Teichripp, that they're pushing universalism, oneism, ecumenism, Gnosticism, theosophy, and whatever flavor of occultism. And they talk about this fake Jesus, this Christ consciousness. Some of them even mention that Jesus was an actual extraterrestrial. And so, if you could maybe tell us about
I first stumbled onto all of this this one world movement, this New Age stuff, when I was working for the government of our state of Indiana. We live just outside of Indianapolis, Indiana, and I worked for a number of years for the lieutenant governor of our state as the Europe and Middle East trade specialist. So I was a point man for our state government, trying to bring business in from overseas by promoting our exports from our state to create more jobs on the home front. So it was a type of economic development job. And so when I traveled overseas, my meetings were actually set up through our U.S. embassies. I worked with the commercial sections of the U.S. embassies, and they would put me together with international business leaders that might be interested in purchasing Indiana products. And so that's kind of how it unfolded. I met some of the most interesting people, but some of them, actually quite a few, working within our State Department, were globalists. And when you spend 3 or 4 days together with people, you talk about all kinds of things. We would have dinner together. Sometimes they'd even invite me to their homes, and we would talk naturally about economic developments, global developments in that area, because that was right in line with what we were doing. And then it's just a step further to talk about unfolding political events. And sometimes we get into religious motivations behind some of this. I mean, it was amazing, some of the conversations that I had. I met an actual witch working for one of the American government affiliates in Australia. I'll never forget that. It seemed like a pretty normal person until we started unfolding what she really believed and where she was at. And I learned quickly not to always share where I was coming from, because then people just, they shut up, or they change how they talk. And so I think there's a time to speak up and boldly and take a stand for things, and other times just to listen. And so I listened. I asked a lot of seemingly dumb questions intentionally sometimes, just to see where people were coming from. And so I met people who I later on realized what they were really espousing was a form of Gnosticism. Um, they were largely coming from a pantheistic worldview, not this idea of God as creator being separate from humans, but everything kind of melding together. And it was mysticism, Eastern mysticism. I remember in India, some of the people I met, especially the nationals from India who had contracted with the U.S. embassy there and the consulates, really pushing Eastern mysticism. But even in Greece in different countries where I was at, I traveled to 23 different countries through my job. And it shocked me that so many people in our State Department, I would say in some of the countries, a majority of them were globalists who I sense would be more committed to the concept of an empowered United Nations and global system of government than they would be loyal to defending our U.S. sovereignty. That's the impression I got. And that totally caught me off guard. But I also met some people, they were few, but who were willing to do everything they could to defend our national sovereignty and the sovereignty of nations in general. And most of those people, almost all of them, were Christians. So it was interesting. There were Christians who were opposed to globalism, and then there was everybody else that seemed to be in one way or another in favor of it, or even belonging to organizations that were pushing that agenda.
That's a good point. I just want to highlight that because just yesterday, one of my New Age peer podcasters was calling out the Abrahamic religions. And we'll get to that in terms of solutions, saying that we just say, oh, we're going to trust God's coming back. There's nothing we can do about it. But that's not what you say in your book, nor what I say. As Christians, we should be active in pushing back tyranny and being peacemakers and doing good for our neighbors and the society. And what we're trying to do. And you just gave the example where most of these, the people who were doing nothing or were allowing globalism to take place were the non-Abrahamic religion, the New Agers, and it was actually the Christians who were, on the front lines holding the line. No?
Yes, exactly. In fact, I'm going to give you one example before I lose my train of thought here, because this kind of summarizes it. And then I want to share actually some of the experiences I had when I was invited to join two organizations that were actually part of this movement. Alice Bailey, who founded Lucifer Publishing Company, and then smartly changed the name to Lucis Trust a little bit later. That was back in the early 1920s. But she had a huge impact, I'd say more than any other single individual, on helping to birth what eventually became known as the New Age movement in loose terms. In her book, Esoteric Healing, which was put out in 1953, which I think was around the time that she died. Most of her writing was during the era of the world wars. She wrote this: "There is, as you well know, no angry God, no hell, and no vicarious atonement," talking about Christ's atonement on the cross there. "And the only hell is the earth itself, where we learn to work out our own salvation. This teaching, anent hell, is a remainder of the sadistic turn which was given to the thinking of the Christian church and to the erroneous teaching to be found in the Old Testament anent Jehovah, the tribal God of the Jews. Jehovah is not God. As these erroneous ideas die out, the concept of hell will fade from man's recollection, and its place will be taken by an understanding of the law, which makes each man work out his own salvation, which leads him to right the wrongs which he may have perpetrated in his lives on earth, and which enables him eventually to, quote, clean his own slate," end quote. And by that, she's talking about reincarnation and karma. So she, again, emulated some of the thinking from the Eastern religions, but strongly opposed anything rooted in biblical Christianity, the Old New Testament. And And so that quote there says a lot. It kind of summarizes where Bailey was coming from. Now, to segue that, right after leaving my job, I was invited to join an organization called the World Constitution and Parliament Association, the WCPA for short. Again, the World Constitution and Parliament Association. And I had a friend of mine, a research partner. We're both doing research into all this by now. And I was moonlighting, doing research while I was still on my job. And then when I left my job, it was kind of a full-time pursuit because I wanted to write a book that put these pieces together to help people understand it better. And this friend of mine, a research partner from Colorado, had been invited to join an organization as a journalist. And they didn't know where she was coming from on this, but they assumed that she was a globalist. And so she played along for a couple of years, but then she had a family crisis that occurred so that she could not be involved in this anymore. So she called me one day and said, Gary, are you willing to have me submit your name and recommend you? And I think that they might approve you because the background I had within the government, Europe and Middle East trade specialist, and it kind of, it could paint the picture of someone who might be a globalist. And so I said, yes, do that. And a couple of weeks later, I got a letter from their Secretary General of the organization. The main organizer at the time, his name was Philip Isley, and inviting me to officially apply for the organization. And then I heard back a short time later, and they said, okay, you're in. And so for about 4 years, I received publications, letters on their letterheads. It was quite fascinating. I mentioned them in my book, The New World Religion, but I went into a little bit more detail on that group in my book, En Route to Global Occupation, and just a summary of what I learned. The organization had leaders from at least a couple hundred other organizations who belong to it. So it's kind of like spokes going out from the center of a wheel. And the leaders of those, at least a couple hundred other organizations, had tens of thousands of members in their organization, sometimes over 1 million. For example, Greenpeace, Hans-Peter Durr from Greenpeace, from the executive committee of Greenpeace, was a very influential member of this organization. You had the former president of the World Council of Churches, Cynthia Waddell, who belonged to this organization. One of the vice presidents, by the way, was Ramsey Clark, who was a former U.S. Attorney General. Here's a man who took an oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution and was one of the leaders in this organization that was all about ultimately helping to bring about a world government. As its name said, World Constitution and Parliament Association. It was kind of blatant. But at the time, they find out about you, you couldn't find out about them. This was not anything public at that time. It was, again, had I not been brought into the organization, I probably would have never known about it. And so I started collecting all these things they sent me. I had some conversations over the phone with Philip Isley. Again, they had no clue where I was really coming from, but it was just a bombshell. I couldn't believe it some days, reading their information. They put out one document, 49 reasons for why we need a world government. And something, I'd say close to a third of them had to do with the environment, one way or another, and ecology. So I knew way back in the 80s that eventually that would become a big part of the push for world government, saying we have to have a world government to solve this alleged environmental crisis. Another biggie was, of course, world peace. For the pursuit of world peace, we have to have a world government. And we have to have a world government to bring in the new global economic system because the current system was going to fail. And they all knew this somehow in advance. And this was all part of the 49 reasons for why we have to have a world government. Basically, every reason you can imagine, they gave as a reason for world government. And that's how these people worked. They took problems, magnified them, and then said, hey, the only solution to this problem, it's too big for one nation to solve. We have to have world government to solve it. I remember, I don't know if you've heard the name Eagle Arvik. At the time, he was the chairman of the Nobel Prize Committee. On one of the letterheads that they used, his name was the first name at the top. Eagle Arvik, chairman of the Nobel Prize Committee, which explained later on, as I discovered, there were a lot of Nobel Prize recipients who belonged to this organization. And I'm not saying that all Nobel Prize recipients are illegitimate somehow. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying a good many of them were brought into this organization, and then the organization helped give them a platform behind the scenes to promote global causes that fed into this world government movement. And I also was sent a copy of a prototype world constitution, which they were calling at the time a constitution for the Federation of Earth, which was somewhat laughable to me because it reminded me of Star Trek. You know, they call the global government the Federation of Earth. And then I discovered that Isaac Asimov, who was one of the futurists that helped conceive Star Trek, belonged to this organization. He was part of all of this. And so I kept, at that point, I was now very interested. I mean, and I was doing countless hours of digging into people's backgrounds, people who belonged to the organization. So I thought I would look into the top 3 leaders at the time. And one of them, as I mentioned, was Philip Isley. He was an integrative engineer, which is a fancy term to be to describe an expert in organizing things, basically. And he came from a Marxist background. He went to Antioch College in Ohio, which back in the 60s was a big part of the Marxist 60s movement. And so I looked into his background and 2 of his top colleagues in the organization. And here's what I found out. Along with being leaders in this World Constitutional Parliament Association, they were also key figures in an organization called World Union, which I'd never heard of before. So I dug into that organization and found out that they were headquartered in India. And World Union was sister organizations very closely tied to a very occultic organization called World Goodwill that was founded by Alice Bailey. And they had offices in London and New York. And that was a product really of Lucifer Publishing Company and Lucis Trust. And so they were just 2 steps removed from Lucifer Publishing Company and the people that tie into that.
And just to add, I frequently mention, you know, we've got the goods, you know. Again, here's 2009. I always show this. This is from the Arcane School Conference in Geneva, where they have the 3rd office. You mentioned New York, London, and Geneva.
Yeah.
And where's
Geneva as well.
And I attended one of their meetings, kind of like what you were doing. Just be like, I want to see what's going on, guys. And they talk about Prometheus and Lucifer, and effectively, like, I try to boil it down. You can't get out of this. Effectively, we can boil down this entire New Age movement that's really Luciferian, satanic, theosophic, and they're trying to convince us that the bad guy is the good guy. They're trying to convince us that Lucifer, no, he's the good guy. God in the Bible, Jesus is the bad guy. And in fact, this Lucifer is the Jesus. And so they're just trying to bring the entire world on board through the social religious aspect, right? To get us on board with what now you're describing, this project for a one world system, right?
Yeah. And Alice Bailey, well, Albert Pike, you know, who was a prominent figure in the secret societies in the 1800s, just came out. I mean, Lucifer was the light bearer. He's the source of light, which then makes the God of the Christians and Jews the God of darkness. And so that's the, and the whole concept of hell, they dismiss that there's nothing of the sort. and any concept of heaven. It's just it's more, their description would be one that lines up more closely with Hinduism or some of the Eastern religions, and that we can work out our own salvation through reincarnation, which Teilhard de Chardin promoted a type of that as a Jesuit priest. He claimed to be a Christian, but everything he taught was in line with pantheism. Same thing with Carl Jung in psychology. But anyway, so I took all this in over 4 years and tried to make sense out of it. And I was blown away that the top leaders in this organization were so closely connected to Lucifer Publishing Company and Alice Bailey and organizations that she started. And so in my first book, I put a lot of this information in there. And when it came out, about 2 months later, I got a really nasty letter from Philip Isley, and I had put their phone number in my book and told people to call them and let them know that they are aware of everything that they are up to, which I'm not sure if that was smart or not, but I wanted to expose this to people. They need to know about this. And so they were pretty upset with me. But by that time, I had already been on something like 40 talk shows, and that was the strategy of my publisher. Believe it or not, a man who wrote on a related topic just a couple of years prior to my book coming out, his name was Randall Baer, and he was pretty high up in the New Age movement. And after attending a conference in Colorado, his car plunged off a cliff and he was killed. And the authorities determined that foul play was involved, but they were never able to figure out who did it. And this had just happened. And he was an author with the publisher that I was going with. And so we just discussed in detail what would be the best way to release the book and offer some protection for me as well. In fact, they were going to give me an alias name to protect my identity. And at the last moment, right before the book was to go to print, they said, you know what, on second thought, we think the best thing to do, both for credibility purposes as well as for your safety, is to come out with the book under your actual name. And then we're just going to put you on a ton of talk shows as quickly as possible. And that's the route we took. But these people were really upset with me. And so I bring all this up to just say one more thing to bring it full cycle. As a result of what happened and them being exposed, and then other people began also talking about that organization, exposing them, they became a very different organization afterwards. They became much more blatantly New Agey and appealing more openly to New Age occultist types. And I remember looking at their website a couple of years after my book came out, and I thought, this isn't an organization that I would take real seriously now, as far as from a geopolitical standpoint, of promoting world government. And that's how these organizations operate. Their leaders usually belong to 3 or 4 different organizations. And so if one organization is exposed, they're like a chameleon, because at least for a time, they take on a different persona and work more through other organizations that are in their network. And so the World Federalist Association at the time, the World Future Society, groups like that, they began working more and more in that direction, politically speaking. But the World Constitutional Parliament Association, in my view, at that time had lost all credibility. Now, more recently, they seem to be coming back around and having somewhat more political influence. So I just wanted to throw that out there, because if you go to their website, it's very different from how things were back in the 80s, because for one thing, they didn't even have websites back then, right? I mean, their website really didn't come on the scene till I think it was well into the late 90s, maybe. And then, of course, after the year 2000 in a more major way.
And something that comes to mind, I had a past guest recommend this book, Hitler and the New Age, The Coming a Holocaust Extermination of Christendom. And you cite bits in your book that, and there's sources about this, that these New Agers, the core group you cite Barbara Marx Hubbard, they want to physically eliminate the obstacle to their new world government, and that is basically anyone who has an exclusive religious belief, which is primarily biblical Christians who say Christ is the only way. And then you mentioned the Vatican is core as a core node in a lot of this movement because, and a lot of these other religions, they promote universalism. All roads lead to heaven or Rome, but they want to at some point eliminate, whether it's economically, socially, or physically, anyone who's standing in the way towards this age of Aquarius, this new world system. And I wanted to get your thoughts as well as where do you think we are at today with world government? I mean, I've got so many books here. We're now the regional units are coming together. This is Dr. Robert Pastor. I did the last living interview with him. I met him. He visited our campus and was promoting North American Union. And now we have the Trump administration putting together the Technocracy, the North American Union. The European Union is the model, I always say. And I've got a book here. It says The Binding of Nations from European Union to World Union. So we're having the African Union put together. Putin is putting together the Eurasian Union. Xi Jinping is putting together ASEAN, the Asian Union. There's that. And then, I've had on the podcast as well, Democracy Without Borders, who's pushing for world parliament, an upgraded UN Parliamentary Assembly, which is something you touch on in your book. You say that they want to create sort of like a people's parliament to give us this feeling that we're participating in this democratic world parliament, but really we're not going to have a say. And then we had Trump. It was in one of your newsletters. I read it from Carl Tykrib. So he creates a new potential world government institution, Board of Peace. Xi Jinping just proposed the Global Governance Initiative. So it's like they're trying to outdo each other on who can create the next iteration of world government. Where do you feel we're at? I kind of feel like we're in the last stretch.
Yeah, I do too. A lot of things are coming together in different ways, but not all of the global forces are working in unison with each other. That's what makes this interesting. There are competitive forces involved. And I think some believe if they can bring about an era of world peace through their way, then it would be a more democratic form of a global system than another system that would be maybe more Marxist, or another one that would be this or that. But it's all kind of moving us in the same direction, and that's the concern. You would know this. The Club of Rome. Back in the 60s.
I got the book right here, 1970, and they divide. I highlighted the map, right, where they divide the world into 10 regions, just like the Book of Daniel. I'm having in a few weeks Pastor Billy Crone come on. He's been talking about this recently of the 10 kings that Daniel talks about, and here they're talking about 10 regions. But anyways, go ahead.
A lot of people think it's 10 leaders of countries from Europe. But in my book, En Route to Global Occupation, I proposed back in 1992, based on that very same map, which I reproduced in my book, that could it be 10 global regions? We at least have to be open to that idea, because that would make a lot of sense. The EU has kind of been the model, and it was hoped that if the concepts of national political boundaries or national sovereignty could be broken down somewhat, where major trading blocs originate, and from an economic standpoint, they would kind of break down the barriers, and then it would be easier to turn those economic trading blocs into political unions, and then eventually take those political unions into a world government, because it would be easier to take, say, 10 regions into a world government than 200 separate sovereign nations. Now, what's interesting with Trump's stuff, and I will tell you this, I have a friend who is in fairly regular meetings with Trump and is an advisor to Trump. So I have to be careful here. He, on a lot of fronts, he defends U.S. sovereignty very strongly. And he also rubs elbows with a few other people who strongly defend their national sovereignty, such as the president of El Salvador, who I met one of his members of parliament in Costa Rica a while back. and seems to be very strong on national sovereignty. And when I met with them, by the way, this is on a rabbit trail, they had gone over 400 days without one homicide in that country, which I thought I misunderstood them. I asked the question 3 different ways. I said, that can't be. Are you? And they said, no. And this was over a year ago, but and so he's a very popular figure there, and the president of Argentina and so forth. So is this a scenario where Trump is genuinely trying to take sovereign nations who are of a more similar mindset, who are opposing overall a lot of the precepts of the United Nations and wanting to be sovereign nations? In other words, is this going to be a type of coalition of sovereign nations? But the danger in that is that too could become another pathway toward globalization. So I'm watching this very, very carefully. I mean, things are coming out almost every week now.
I do have to add, just add real quick on El Salvador, to burst the bubble a bit. I did find, it was about 2-3 years ago, a report where Bukele of El Salvador, he did say that we should copy the EU and create a Central American Union. And I know my former president of Mexico, because I'm a Mexican citizen, AMLO, López Obrador, ad nauseum, he would give interviews where he said we should copy the EU and create a North American Union, Canada, USA, Mexico. And then countless South American leaders, Rafael Correa, ex-president of Ecuador, gave an interview that same year saying we should copy the EU and create a South American Union. So these are ideas are out there.
Yeah, definitely. And now with the embroilment with the war in Iran, that makes things even that much more interesting, because as of today, even though the military has knocked out the top 3 layers of the Iranian government, they're hitting more targets in more countries right now than when the war started. At least it seems that way to me. I mean, yesterday, again, some of the natural gas areas were hit. They're on fire in Qatar and the UAE. And so, because much of what's happening in the world today is happening in the name of world peace. And if Iran can be eliminated as a terrorist nation, and I'm not supporting Iran at all, because they have supported, the bulk of terrorism that's been going on around the world. But I think this administration is going to have its hands full, more full than what they thought of. I mean, because these people, they don't mind dying for the cause. They think they're going to get a better reward as a result for doing so. And so how many layers deep does this have to go before there's anybody who's going to cooperate in any kind of a way? But all this to say this: if Trump can somehow pull off a real significant defeat of Iran's regime, where it is basically toppled and no longer able to do what it's been doing, then I want to see what he does next regarding the whole Mideast peace scenario and that kind of thing. Because if he gains credibility through all that, then will there be some type of global system coming together in the name of war, in the name of world peace? But if Trump gets bogged down in this, what's going on, and he's totally hated by the far left in the U.S. right now, and more people on the right have been opposing, his going into Iran. So he's not very popular at all. And so as far as globalists go, and a number of the globalist leaders are shunning him. So again, I kind of right now I see almost like a competition of different aspects of globalism, and I don't know how it's all going to shake out. But I believe in the end, we have to look at the Bible, and what the Bible lays out is going to happen. And you're going to have a very antichrist global system that hates anything having to do with the Judeo-Christian worldview, the Old New Testament together, because that's the truth. And I believe that with all my heart. And they're going to try to do away with that to bring in an era of Luciferianism, at least in the higher levels. How it's going to be presented publicly, exactly remains to be seen. But they have to turn the Bible on its head and completely redefine everything. And their greatest difficulty in doing that, in my view, is in them attempting to explain away Bible prophecies that have already been fulfilled. Because when you have things written thousands of years ago and then they occur exactly the way it's been written, that's pretty convincing. How do you argue with that? And so if that track record is there, then why would we not also then believe that any prophecies that are not yet fulfilled, that are still future tense, that they will be fulfilled as well, just as the ones that have already taken place. And so when you look at the prophecies regarding Jesus Christ's return, I believe that's what's going to happen, and we're being forewarned about those kinds of things. And in places like parts of Matthew chapter 24, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the book of Revelation, where it talks about Armageddon and the forces of the Antichrist gathering together to defeat basically Christ at his return, which is a crazy thought. But and I always wonder, how is the Antichrist going to succeed in so deceiving the populations of the earth if they're willing to gather against Jesus Christ at his return to try to fight him? So you're talking about an enormous deception that's even beyond, I mean, us as researchers, who kind of have an idea of what's going on. I think it's even going to be almost beyond us, our ability to imagine the scale of this.
I'm getting to that point where it's becoming truly, the psyops are getting better. But you mentioned that in your book, a bit of it as well. I mean, just a few points. I'm seeing some of this alternative media, which I think is actually in collusion with the globalists. They're seeding out so they're preparing the ground for this deception. They're seeding out the ideas of theosophy, oneism, and ascended masters, and then some of them, the same people, then so they cultivate first that ground to get in our seed in our heads this idea of oneism, Luciferianism, theosophy, and the ascended masters, and then they start talking about UFOs and extraterrestrials, because those will then be like, oh, these are the ascended masters, or Ridley Scott.
Just another explanation. Yeah, just another explanation. You have all these people, millions of people in North America who are every day going into altered states of consciousness through occult meditation. Some of them maybe not realizing that this opens up the gateway to the satanic realm. It's like saying, here I am, come through and communicate to me. But most of them, they think they're talking to a spirit guide, an ascended master, all kinds of different names that are used to describe this. But to give a better understanding of where this is all headed, Hitler was into all of this. In fact, there are over 1,000 Tibetan monks living in Berlin during the Nazi regime, and he tried to bring in more of them, both from India Hindus as well as Tibetan Buddhist masters, and had given them, I don't know if you want to call it a command or a mandate, to be meditating on his behalf. He believed that this would help him to succeed, and he did a tremendous amount of damage, and came closer than people realized maybe to having a type of world government in that day. But he was into all of this stuff and into ascended masters, this idea that there are this hierarchy of higher initiates, and generally, I think New Agers, when they first come into the occult, they don't exactly know what they believe. They just know they're having this experience that they can't explain, and it's kind of addicting. So they get drawn further and further into it. And I've described to friends as kind of being like a pyramid, where the higher ups, they realize where they want to take things. But the second tier, they're kind of, they fill specific commands, and they're kind of loyal to those above them. They get a bit of the picture, but not fully. And then by the time you get down to the grassroots, a lot of these people, they're people tripped out on LSD or into tantric yoga, and they're having these experiences that all they know is they feel like it's a bliss, and so they're drawn in. But I really think some of these people, if they had any clue what they're really involved in, might reconsider and try to get out. But I think many of them don't, and that's why it's important to do programs like this to really get them to see what Alice Bailey, who promoted all these occultic techniques, what was she really rooted in? It was Luciferianism, and Blavatsky, who put out The Secret Doctrine. Her book, more than anything else, probably influenced Hitler. He kept a copy of her book at his bedside with his personal notes scribbled in the margins of the book. So he was into theosophy and all these New Age occult teachings, as were many of the people around him. He had surrounded himself with people heavily involved in the occult.
And there I often bring up, he's an ex-Satanist, and what I do like about him is that he's upfront about his beliefs. So he's an ex-Satanist, Mark Passio, and he speaks out against Satanism and the occultocracy, as he calls it. But he's still an open sort of like hermeticist or something. So he's upfront. He tells you know where he is. But he gave a masterful 4-hour lecture, high level, on. Like, you can't, because there's still a minority of people that listen to the podcasts who believe and sympathize with Hitler and the Nazis. And I'm like, go listen to Mark Passio's lecture, 4 hours. He gives the name. He's got all the names and the numbers demonstrating, how what you're saying, that Hitler was an occultist. And you mentioned the antichrist system. Just in the interest of time, I want to just get your thoughts, because you mentioned it in your newsletter. That's the other piece of the puzzle. So we got world religion, we got world government, and then they've got to sort of force us into it, because a lot of us really don't want it, this antichrist system. So this sort of technocracy, what in 2000 I said was coming, a global algocracy ruled by AI algorithm, or one of my past podcast guests, I'm not sure if you mentioned him in your book, Edwin Black, who wrote IBM and the Holocaust. He calls it the algorithm ghetto, or this social credit system. It's happening in every single nation as we speak, and I've had our own Department of Homeland Security ban me for PayPal for thought crime, because I was espousing these truths. And just yesterday, I got a new veiled threat from the Pentagon, from these online networks on X, who I know are part of the security state, and now they're coming after podcasters who are towing the lines that they disagree with. So we're going to see how that plays out. But just your thoughts on sort of this push for CBDCs, digital ID. We had the vaccine. COVID was like a first run. Here in Mexico, we've got 3 months to register our phones, or they're suspended. We got to give our biometrics for the digital national ID, or we can't buy and sell. And so just your thoughts sort of on this technological control grid.
Yeah. Well, Pat Wood, who's a friend of mine, he goes into excellent detail on all of this, and studies and knows technocracy inside and out. But you can't operate a world system at a high level without a bunch of technocrats ruling. And a lot of times these are people whose names you don't know, and there's a hierarchy associated with it, and that's what makes it difficult. But a lot of the NGOs are really pushing this. I think they'll be a big part of a world system. Also, a lot of people aren't aware of how laws are made. In our U.S. Congress, you have these documents that come out that are 300 to 500 pages long that people don't even have time to read. And people just assume that a congressman drafted all this. They don't have time to do that. Their staffs don't even have time in most cases to draft some of these lengthy documents. A lot of these come from think tanks like the Brookings Institute and organizations like that. Most of which are very globalist and are pushing a globalist agenda. And so then these institutions, they will find a sponsor in Congress and say, will you sponsor this in the form of a bill? That's how a lot of this happens. And so, these congressional representatives or senators, in some cases, are simply spokespeople for this information being funneled to them. In some cases, good. In more cases, not so good. I mean, we do have some sponsors in Congress who are trying to bring out some solid legislation. But you look at all the thousands of NGOs that exist in the United States. And on a per capita basis, I found out a few months ago, Germany has the most NGOs, tax-exempt NGOs on a per capita basis. A lot of them coming out of Europe, also the United States. And so whenever I see NGO, I don't want to jump to conclusion and say that it's automatically bad, but it seems like 80 or 90% of the time it is. And so that's where a lot of this technocratic establishment that is emerging. It's within those NGOs that are tightly affiliated with the United Nations. And so it'll be interesting to see what President Trump does in the Middle East, because if he's going to go anywhere with his peace initiatives and with this board of peace, he's not going to be able to get much done in terms of implementing it unless technocrats come on board in a major way, and they're virtually almost all globalists. Although you could argue the definition of technocrat exactly what it is, but the bulk majority of them are globalists. So one way or another, it seems to me, humanity is going to be sucked into this and drawn into it. The question is, how much time will it take? You know, how much longer will we have a semblance of freedom? And I've never been a date setter. I think it's the most foolish thing to do, because you can lose your credibility quickly that way. But what I have shared in the past is certain timetables that I've stumbled onto that some of these organizations have set for when they want to accomplish certain things. And I know the World Economic Forum, as well as the UN, the year 2030 has been a big target date to have a lot of this, if not all of it, in place by. And so that's just, a few short years away. And so the push is really on now. Whenever a date has been set like that, they do everything they can to push toward that. And then if they don't accomplish it, at least from their perspective, they will have taken a giant step in that direction. And then they'll recalibrate and reconsider and set a new date to go the next step. So I think the next 3 or 4 years are extremely critical. And we see, the world really in a state of crisis right now, both with what's going on in the Middle East. We know that the globalists want to bring about an entirely new economic system. We see the CBDCs, something like 40 different countries, I forget the exact number, but several dozen countries want to bring the CBDCs in this year or next year. And so it's possible within 2 years, we're going to be in a very different place on that front economically as banks begin to force this on people. And then, are they going to need an economic collapse to fully bring this about so that they can argue we have to have a new system because the old world system has failed us? And so as this Iran war, things go wrong there and this thing gets dragged out and oil prices keep going up, it could quickly snuff out any kind of economic recovery and take us into a deep dive. Not saying that will happen, but I'm saying the potential is there for that. So things could change much more quickly than what people realize. And that's the third stool of this. You have the religious side, the political, and the economic. And people are controlled probably more than anything else through the economic side and the purse strings. And we saw some attempts of that through COVID and what happened there. And so a lot of moving parts all at the same time. I wrote in a recent article, we can be thankful to know how it all ends. I'm confident that God will have the final say. I think between now and then, things are going to get pretty rough and people are going to have to choose sides. They're either going to be part of this and go along with it all, eventually take the mark of the beast, or they're going to stand firm on all that against it. And possibly pay for their lives, but have a secure eternity. So I decided at the age of 11, after accepting Christ, that year in school, I had a school teacher who, as one of our first history lessons, it was on World War II and what took place there. And this teacher, you don't have teachers like this anymore today, but she was on it and understood what happened. And so I got it both from home because of what my parents went through, and then also in the public school I was at in Kettering, Ohio at the time. And I remember one day sitting toward the back in that room and just grasping the magnitude of what happened and how deceptive it was and how people fell for it, and were drawn into it. And I prayed silently to God, and I said, God, if anything were to ever happen like this again during my lifetime, like what happened during World War II, I promise to you I will take a stand for you regardless of the cost, thinking even if it costs me my life. And so I made a commitment at the age of 11. Things aren't getting any easier. We have a 94-year-old father, the same father who fled at age 12 from Croatia. He's still alive. We're taking care of him up in years. And I just wonder if he's going to live long enough to see all this come about. I mean, it's going that quickly, but hopefully you and I and other people will be able to have a semblance of freedoms left, that we can get the message out and warn people, and that God will bless our efforts, and that we'll be able to reach as many people as possible while we have time.
Yeah, you make me think of, I was a history a major teacher, adjunct professor, and you used to think decades ago, I wonder what it'd be like to live through like the World War II times, and then here we are, effectively. I'm like, you know what? Never mind, and
Yeah.
And what you said, I view a lot of what's happening with Iran now is like the Great Reset. It's the sequel to COVID, because now they're saying stay at home, no energy, so stay home. Food prices are going up, fertilizer, and so a lot of the same protocols they had for COVID are now being brought back because of the energy crisis. And I joked the other day, it's almost like, no one believes in global warming and the theory of man-made global warming, so they're just shutting the energy off. And they're like, okay, you guys don't believe it, we're turning it off, and you're going to stay home. But I just want to bring up a point where I've used this example for years, and I found it in your book where, I think there are many prophetic elements to Israel, yet I view the state of Israel just like any other state on planet Earth. All man is sinful and fallible and corrupt, and so
Right.
are all governments. And so they're doing things that are, the government of Israel is still, let's say, antichrist, just like any other government. They have rejected Christ, and they're kind of, and I would use the example of that. They are like a disobedient child, the state of Israel, but that doesn't mean that God is still, He's not going to discipline them and bring them back. And in your book here on page 247, you say, God sent a steady stream of holy prophets to teach Israel his ways and warn them of what would happen if they did not obey, because all throughout history, Israel would reject God, not listen to him. And you say, much like the relationship between a loving father and his child, while longing for his child Israel to be obedient, there were times when that child was rebellious and needed to be disciplined before something much worse happened. And I'm like, I've literally been saying that for years. So I'm not crazy. I'm not the only one. So I just want to mention that. And then finally, I always ask my guests, what do we do? And then how to survive. In one of your recent, I think, newsletters, you say basically what a lot of my guests have said, common sense stuff, which is good. It's confirming what we should be doing. You say, in terms of how to survive, diversify your assets in such a way they're outside of the traditional banking system, owning physical assets, real estate, in states or countries which are now restricting the use of CBDCs, precious metals, gold, silver, that you can personally hold for barter, owning decentralized crypto, such as Bitcoin, may be a temporary alternative, because again, who controls the internet? And then in your book, you say, this is for all the people who say the Christians are just trusting the plan, and no, you say, stand firm. You quote the Apostle Paul, be on guard, stand firm in the faith, be men of courage, be strong, let nothing move you. You say that to inform Christian friends about the deceptive teachings of the New Age, be involved in your schools, share the truth about the current world situation, living a positive Christian example, praying for elected officials. I'd even say petitioning, right? So just any final thoughts on here?
Well, it comes down to what Jesus talked about his followers being salt and light. And I mean, if people should be able to look at our lives and see something different about us that they would be drawn to as we reflect the life of Jesus, and that's a challenge because we're all sinners and we have this fallen DNA, and so it's a challenge every day. But to walk with the Lord and reflect Him in our lives. And some people will just overtly reject it, but other people, even there were Nazis in World War II that along the way, I mean, a small number of them, but that accepted Christ because of the influence of Christians around them that they saw. They couldn't argue with the fact there was something so different about these Christians at a core level that it was a testimony to them, comparing that and contrasting that to the Nazi war machine and what Hitler was all about. And so I would just say, live out your life every moment of every day with the indwelling of the Holy Spirit as a Christian to set a positive example, and don't miss opportunities to share the truth. Don't come across like a raving tirade. It's not going to go anywhere, but just calmly talk to people. These are people with souls just like us who have been deceived on different fronts and been drawn into something. And I mean, some of the strongest Christians I know right now are people who were formerly involved in the New Age movement, because they get it now. They were in it and came out and realized the darkness of what they were involved in. And so don't give up on these people, regardless of their religious background. And sometimes you have to become an acquaintance or a friend with people to dialogue with them. But there's a danger with that too. You have to be careful that you're not drawn into their beliefs. So always be prayed up and stand firm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've got someone attending our church from Scotland here in Mexico. He was a former New Ager. He actually said, and he's suffered as a result certain physical ailments, but he told me that he would be able to manifest demons or fallen angels, because he was, he was like basically saying, I'll sell my soul, do whatever, just, and getting involved in some of these occult practices detailed in your book and, in general, and these spirits would come. And so, well, we've covered the waterfront. People can get your books, go to your website. You've got also talks there that are available in your newsletter. Where are the best places for people to go?
Yeah, just go to our website, which is www.garykah.org. And my name is spelled GaryKah, GaryKah.org. And for those of your listeners who prefer to read in Spanish, my first book has been translated into Spanish. In fact, it was done so from Monterrey, Mexico. And it's available at our website. It's, I think, the second row down in our store. So we do have that available in Spanish as well. And then we put out a quarterly publication, which we're getting so much information now. The biggest challenge is knowing how to narrow it down to a 16-page, or usually it's 16 or 20 pages long. And we carry articles by some of the world's top researchers in this whole area of globalism. So, and I'll just close with a verse of scriptures from Nahum 1:7. I have it sitting on my desk every day looking at me. It says, "The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and He knoweth them that trust in Him." And that gives me comfort. We should never feel alone. If we are a Christian, God knows our situation. He is there. And our boldness and courage should come from being plugged into Him. And if you aren't, then you need to do so, and you need to make that change in your life, make that decision.
You just made me think of yesterday. I was listening to a podcast from Living Waters, who I'm a big fan of, and I've met Ray Comfort and Mark Spence, and they, on their podcast, they were talking about, I'm not afraid of the mark of the beast, the digital ID, and that. And I'm like, that's the spirit. That's the attitude we should have. No fear. Yeah. Thank you, Gary. Hvala. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. God bless you.